Welcome to The Forgotten Soldier by Guy Sajer, a gripping and deeply personal story of a young soldier caught up in the chaos of the Eastern Front. These are his words. Let's begin. We moved back to the north as a junction with the Courland Front was no longer possible. What was left of the division gradually regrouped. The attempt to reunite the front had inflicted terrible losses. During this time, in a desperate lunge further to the south, the Russians reached the Baltic. Fighting of unequaled ferocity had taken place at many points through and around the swarms of terrified refugees who made it very difficult for our troops to defend themselves. The entire Prussian civilian population was fleeing toward the coast in a tragic tide. We ourselves had two choices. We could turn south, opening a route through several advanced Soviet positions, or move back to the north toward the newly established front at Memel. However, the divisional command quickly realized that we no longer had the means to move south toward Königsberg or even Elbing. Both towns were equally threatened, and the closest was some 100 miles away. We would have to fight for every mile, with little chance of success and almost no possibility of picking up any food along this route of mass exodus. So Memel was chosen, a short front which had been practically surrounded since the autumn. We would have to fight our way through, to make a passage for ourselves and for the flood of refugees moving with us, constantly slowing us down and often nearly paralyzing us, a pitiful, imploring procession, dragging on foot through the bitter cold and the slush of the first snows. In spite of orders, we had to help, reassure, and support this chaotic wash of human beings. Everyone with an engine which would still run, even for an hour, carried a swarm of terrified children, trembling with cold and fear and God knows what else, while their families ran alongside, mixed in with the soldiers who were their last hope of protection. We passed through towns and villages where the inhabitants had still been living a more or less normal life until 4 or 5 days earlier, although they had realized that their danger might become imminent at any time. Now, for the last 2 days, old men, women, and children had been desperately digging out the trenches, gun pits, and anti-tank ditches, which were to stop the waves of enemy tanks. This pathetic and heroic effort before the infernal debacle which would sweep them into the flux of terrorized civilians was a preliminary shock for these virtuous civilians who saw the front coming toward them in the form of exhausted, half-starved troops, tired of fighting and of living, who brushed aside human pawns without a qualm, as if they were pieces in a losing game of chess. Every time a defense seemed possible, it was undertaken. The enemy at our heels were slaughtering the civilian population, who watched their approaching end in mute horror. The enemy had to be slowed down. The groups impressed into this effort accepted their fate in the ludicrous hope of putting out fires which were already raging. Their situation and sentiments were understood, and their misery measured and valued by those who came to bid them farewell. These men had reached the point beyond which death seemed desirable, and still the war went on, like a blazing fire which no sentiment, however realized, could stop. Those who broke through and reached Memel would probably die at Memel. Death at Memel would seem a relief and release, and a more orderly end than death in a place which would never be distinguished by any military operation. At this time and place, the absolute would be resolved by the absurd, unless perhaps they were already the same thing. Finally, our division, which is to say a third of it, broke through, and the command at Memel was able to include it in their strength. The division had broken through, and the 1,500 men it cost us simply represented another figure to swell the note of heroism. For those who had been in the fighting, besides the men who were killed, the losses included some 20 names which had to be scrubbed from the company lists, including Siemenleis and Vinky. We might perhaps have fought our way into a trap. We even thought that perhaps the Russians had deliberately loosened their grip to let us through. We had brought along with us as many civilians as we could, but many others had stayed behind, and for them, the game was nearly over. They had to dodge the tanks pursuing them, and multiple barrages of howitzers and quadruple machine guns and Ivan's bayonets, all of which is very difficult for a mother with an infant at her breast and a small child hanging onto her skirts. But after all, everyone is born to die. We arrived in Memel with trucks pulled by men and tanks serving as locomotives to trains of incredible length. We had reached the absolute limit of our capacities. Everything which still possessed a shred of human or mechanical life was moving, suppressing misery to a sense of gratitude that so much at least was still allowed them. Bombing stopped only those who were definitively dead. The rest, the merely wounded or dying, kept on with burning eyes, pushing past the collapsing and the collapsed, whose bodies lay strewn along the road. The town of Memel was still alive, in ruins beneath the flames, the smoke-darkened sky, the throb of Russian fighter-bombers, the heavy artillery, the terror, and the whirling snow. Once again, I cannot find the words to describe what I saw. My impression is that all words and syllables were perfected to describe unimportant things. Words cannot describe the end of the war in Prussia. I was part of the exodus in France, fleeing the German troops, which I later joined, and I saw mothers asking for milk at quiet farms. I also saw overturned cars, and was once even machine-gunned near Montargis. But my memories of all that are touched with only a small degree of anxiety, which is even somewhat intoxicating, like the memory of a trip on which one was not alone. Also in France the weather was beautiful. In Prussia it was snowing and everything had been destroyed all around us. Refugees were dying by the thousands, and no one was able to help them. The Russians, when they were not fighting our troops, pushed the tide of civilians along in front of them, firing at them and driving tanks through the terrified mob. Anyone with a little imagination can try to conceive what I am talking about. Cruelty has never been more fully realized, nor can the word horror ever adequately express what happened. We had reached the Memel cul-de-sac, a half-circle about 15 miles across, backing onto the Baltic, whose cold gray swells rolled in under a thick blanket of fog. We held this constantly shrinking space by some inexplicable miracle for most of the winter, harassed by continuous bombardment and permanent attack from the Russians, whose strength grew steadily as ours dwindled, overrun by thousands upon thousands of refugees. The extreme of misery to which these people were reduced can never be adequately described. They waited at Memel to be evacuated by sea before the troops were taken off in mid-December. The ruins of Memel could neither hold nor shelter the large segment of the Prussian population which had sought refuge there. This population, to which we could give only the most rudimentary help, paralyzed our movements and our already precarious system of defense. Within the half-circle we were defending, ringing with the thunder of explosions which covered every sort of shriek and scream, former elite troops, units of the Volkssturm, amputees re-engaged by the services organizing the defense of the town. Women, children, infants, and invalids were crucified on the frozen earth beneath a ceiling of fog, lit by the gleam of fires, or beneath the blizzards which emptied their snows over this semi-final act of the war. The food ration was so meager that the occasional distributions which were supposed to feed 5 people for a day would not now be considered enough for a school child's lunch. Appeals for order and observation of the restrictions rang incessantly through the fog, which in part veiled the scene. Ships of every kind were leaving by day and by night, loaded with as many people as they could carry. Long files of refugees, whom the authorities tried vainly to register, moved toward the piers, creating targets for Russian pilots which were impossible to miss. The bombs opened hideous gaps in the screaming crowd, which died in fragments beneath these blows, but remained in line in hopes of getting on the next ship. These people were exhorted to patience, reminded of the rationing, and told to fast while they waited for deliverance. Old people killed themselves, and mothers of families, who would hand their children over to another woman, begging her to feed them with the ration card she herself was giving up. A gun taken from a dead soldier would accomplish these jobs. Heroism and despair were closely intertwined. The authorities tried to keep up the spirits of the crowd by speaking of the future, but at that time and place everything had lost its importance. These martyrs often watched suicides without really trying to stop them. Some, in a surge of madness, shot themselves on the pile of bodies which civilian aides collected in each district. Capitulation would at least have put an end to this hideous nightmare, but Russia inspired such terror and had demonstrated such cruelty that no one even considered the idea. We had to hold no matter what it cost us until we were eventually evacuated by sea. We had to hold or die. Or perhaps the High Command had another idea. Perhaps they were planning to transform the stronghold at Memel into a bridgehead from which they would launch a counterattack to split the Soviet thrust. This last speculation struck those of us holding the town as sheer fantasy. However, soldiers were still landing at Memel as the civilians left. We could only suppose they had come to strengthen our position. The idea of a counterattack seemed entirely unrealistic. Here we fought with the stubbornness so much admired by the High Command, solely because we still hoped there might be some sort of launch left at the end to take us out after the last civilian had been evacuated. We had to hold on, even if despair had separated us from all other human conditions. At Memel, no one could stay out of the fighting. Children and young girls dried their tears and helped the wounded, distributing food, resisting their desire to devour it, and suppressing horror and fear which were so fully justified. They performed tasks which their overburdened elders gave them without argument or complaint. One either died or lived. No intermediate condition could be given any consideration. The children all felt this fact without discussion or explanation. Those who survived this dramatic training would never be able to take the normal difficulties of normal life seriously. The German people really experienced the depth of things and left me with an ineffable feeling of respect, which I can describe no further. In the disorder of our advanced positions, civilians sometimes became directly involved in the fighting beside the soldiers. These civilians were often women. At the price of heavy sacrifice, the front held. By held, I mean that it did not crumble altogether. In fact, it was constantly yielding in one or several places and constantly shrinking. The long anti-tank trenches we had dug beforehand played a large part in the consolidation of our defense. The Russians depended above all on their aviation and their heavy artillery, which they strengthened constantly to knock us out. Nonetheless, their attacks cost them heavily. The contraction of our front allowed us to concentrate our defense. Memel was ringed with innumerable carcasses of Russian tanks, and there were as many anti-tank gunners as there were ordinary soldiers. Carloads of mines were driven out by civilian volunteers and placed in front of our defenses by the infantry in the course of small counterattacks organized solely for this maneuver. We were defenseless only against aviation. Russian fighter bombers flew over continually. To the northwest of our position, the remains of several dismantled railway carriages underwent 8 attacks in 2 days. What was left of our anti-aircraft defense was concentrated around the piers, where the peril was greatest. This target constituted a real danger to the Russian pilots, who preferred to attack the rest of the stronghold, where there was no serious resistance. Thus, despite the hell of cold and fire and shortage, despite the names scratched daily from our lists, Memel, almost incredibly, held. Then one gray afternoon, some elements of our famous division were regrouped at a precise point. Ammunition for an offensive was handed out, and we were given 2 tins of food each without regard to the contents. Some received a pound of applesauce, others a pound of margarine. However, these variations seemed insignificant compared to the fact that the ghost of German military organization was still functioning during those days of grace on the fringes of a disintegrated city, which would still be known as Memel for a short time. Supplies, although obviously rationed to the limit, were still distributed before an offensive. Incredible as it may now seem, the vestigial remnants of the German army in Memel were to attempt an offensive to the south, whose aim was to re-establish contact with the front at Kranz and Königsberg. The officers who prepared the maneuver issued their directives to the disillusioned ears of combat veterans. Hals and I were jolted from the void in which we had grown used to living. We were accustomed to the most astounding orders, but this time the fact that we were going to hurl ourselves into an assault with the incredibly slender means available to us made us tremble and reel with uncontrollable vertigo. A few tanks which were still intact would support our progress. Materiel, which belonged to the Kurland soldiers, and even some from Germany, had been delivered. We were to proceed to a village some 10 miles to the south. on the road which followed the coast, beside a large bay. The commanding officer of the operation chose a moment of appalling weather to launch his offensive. It was simultaneously snowing and raining. The atmospheric conditions were so disastrous that even the Russian artillery had practically stopped functioning. It was this circumstance which our leaders hoped to exploit on our last lunatic expedition. A dozen dirty gray tanks went out to meet an inexorable fate. The black crosses painted on their gray sides the color of our misery were scarcely visible. Inside the turrets, the ride of the Valkyrie was coming over the shortwave radios, a fitting accompaniment to supreme sacrifice. Decrepit trucks carrying field pieces and heavy machine guns followed close behind, replacing the full-track caissons of panzer grenadiers of our prosperous days. A mass of infantry, mixed with the remnants of naval and aerial groups, ran along beside the motorized material. My group, in which, to my joy, I recognized the faces of Hals and Wiener, were clinging to the exposed chassis of an automobile which had been stripped of its skin. With ludicrous ease, our point units surprised a camp of Russian armor lined up under the snow as if on parade. The Russians, staggered by this absolutely unforeseen blow, abandoned the camp, which we burned, using one of our special incendiary techniques. A supply of Soviet fuel allowed us to think of pushing our offensive even farther, and we went on despite the gusts of wind which lashed our hands and cheeks. Several concentrations of Russian troops gave way before our surprise thrust. However, the enemy was massed around Memel in depth, and as soon as they struck back, our thrust came to an end. We could hear the first Russian reaction and knew that we would soon be inundated by a merciless rain of fire and that the first Russian tanks were already rolling toward us. As things were reaching a critical point for us, we heard artillery fire from the sea. The bad weather prevented us from seeing the ships just offshore, but their providential fire fell on the red tide as it moved toward us. 2 or 3 destroyers or torpedo boats had come especially to support us. Despite zero visibility, the coordinates supplied by our tanks in forward positions enabled the ships to fire with considerable precision, and the Russian thrust was more or less stopped. It was also possible that the Russians, who were farther inland, misjudged the source of our fire and supposed that we possessed more ground artillery than we actually did. However, none of this made any real difference. The Russians possessed infinitely greater means than we did. Toward the end of the day, our meager operation was attacked along a flank of some 6 miles. This was much more than we could take. Soon, half our tanks were on fire. As foreseen, we had failed and were ordered to return to Memel, 6 miles back the way we'd come, which was far more difficult than the way out. We abandoned the road we had followed for our last epic attack, except for our motorized materiel, which separated as widely as possible when the Russians fired. In the darkness, striped with thousands of lights, breathless troops were running across the dunes from one hole to the next, valuing each step which brought them closer to Memel. As a crowning blow, the column had to cross a stretch of road we ourselves had mined that morning. We tramped a mile lit by flares and streaked with white flashes. The road was narrow but still more or less intact, except for a few shell holes. The first vehicles drove full speed down that infernal space. The Russians had not yet had the time to adjust their aim, and their shells fell beyond us. However, their second round was more successful. 2 trucks were hit dead-on and disintegrated. 2 more, although they were mangled and torn, got through to less dangerous ground. The wreckage of the first 2 obstructed the road, and we were sent to clear it away. Ivan was now quite close, letting us have it with grenade launchers and peppering us with machine gun fire. Despite our intense terror, we tried to keep on firing back as we climbed the slippery banks of flying gravel. The ditches where we might have found shelter had been mined. We were caught in a trap we had prepared ourselves. Several of our men fell, their arms flung outward and their eyes fixed for the last time on the dark, tormented sky. While we waited, our small band clung to the possibilities of survival. We waited beside the first 2 vehicles which had been wrecked and were obstructing the passage. All around us, Russian grenades were exploding, illuminating the darkness. A Russian quadruple machine gun was spraying the edge of the ditch, which was luckily somewhat higher than the road. The Russian guns swept much of the wreckage from the road, jarring the shattered heaps further into disintegration with each salvo. Beside these fragments of metal, which had lost almost all their shape, lay two men in their ragged uniforms, men who, like us, had believed in a way out and were now eternally at rest. We would have to clear the road of the wreckage which still obstructed it, but anyone who stood up would probably be hit. Once again, Viner the veteran emerged from our petrified group. On his knees under the flying bullets, he hurled a grenade at the first heap of metal and blew it from the road. The second wreck went up the same way. The third, a 3.5-ton truck, required 4 grenades. Unfortunately, the wounded men inside the truck were blown up too, but that's war. Toward midnight, at the height of the storm, 2/3 of our men were back in Memel. The command had become aware of our enterprise and had provided covering fire. In a state of exhaustion, we arrived at the rear of our entrenched camp. Inventory of the missing was taken outside among the ruins of a bathing establishment. Then, in the perpetual roar of noise from the front, we settled down and tried to sleep, even though the circumstances were so heavily against it that the attempt itself was an act of heroism. The next day, toward 11 in the morning, when we had finished eating the rations distributed before the offensive, we were sent back to posts which had to be defended. In our dramatic situation, our rest periods could not be of any greater duration. Civilians continued to embark, despite all the risks this entailed. Seas were running high, and all the buildings were covered with frost. Their human complement were waiting to leave from the jetty. Although the waves sprayed their bluish faces, there wasn't the slightest murmur of complaint. Our troops continued to deny the Russians access to the town and its immediate surroundings. The possibility of evacuation by sea represented such a lifeline that a maximum effort was mounted to make it possible for us to hold on. Food, munitions, and medicines were sent in. On certain days, our hammering from the Russians seemed to be diminishing, and despite the cold which grew daily more intense, life seemed easier. We didn't realize that the Soviet armies were concentrating their efforts farther south. Königsberg, Heiligenbeil, Elbing, and then Gottenhofen were increasingly threatened. The problem of refugees, as I learned later, was 10 times greater in those places. The Russians abandoned Memel for the moment to cut further into Prussia, where they were met with desperate resistance. However, they swept it all aside. The 3 powerful Soviet armies which had entered German territory possessed means infinitely greater than those remaining to us. In addition to this, they were inspired by savage feelings of vengeance. The tortured population of Prussia were indelibly instructed in what this meant. Elsewhere, scattered through the population, were Lithuanians, anti-communist Russians, Poles, and even English and Canadian prisoners, who shared our fate, even at Memel. The general terror of Russia superseded all national divisions and differences of opinion. It was a brute fact, simple and unassimilable. When no other course was possible, everyone fled, even the English and Canadian prisoners. The likelihood of being distinguished by the Russian assault units was too doubtful. Women of all ages were exposed to another form of outrage. The number of people evacuated by sea must have risen into the millions. The veteran had carefully set up his light machine gun in the ruins of a house whose walls rose no higher than 3 feet from the ground. From time to time, he brushed the snow from the breach with the back of his hand, which had turned gray from repeated frostbite. Since our last attack to the south of the town, the veteran seemed to have regained his calm. The nervous excitement which affected all of us no longer seemed to touch him. He no longer took part in our desperate discussions and seemed to have separated himself from all our sufferings. The war, the cold, and all the other horrors which plagued us no longer seemed to touch him. His manner was strange, and we wondered about his frame of mind. However, that morning, his light machine gun had saved us from a Russian patrol, which had become particularly interested in our group. 20 Russian bodies lay stiffening in front of the Volkssturm truck, which continued to function despite the fact that one of its back wheels was a thick log wedged against the chassis, another of the minor miracles of Memel. Then the Russians had sent a 50-millimeter bullet under its hood, finishing off the two old men dressed as soldiers who sat in the cab. Hours later, the damn thing was still blocking our view. The Russians had tried to use it as a shield to get close enough to wipe us out with grenades, but Wiener had riddled them with enough fire to finish them off too. Speed had been the critical factor, and Wiener had simply been the quickest. Now he sat in silence, wiping his gun as if it were a precious jewel. The rest of us, Hals, Lindbergh, two others, and I, remained sitting in nervous agitation behind our cold, gray weapons, fully aware that they were no longer enough to guarantee our safety. I had at my disposal 3 Panzerfausts and the new submachine gun which the Volkssturm had recently distributed, an extremely effective weapon which combined features of both the light machine gun and the old submachine gun. I also had a small magnetic mine, which gave my stomach an extra turn. At Memel, we each carried enough of an armory to ensure a quick death. With all that load, there was no question of getting away quickly. We were to hold our position for about 2 more weeks, fighting off more or less soft attacks every 48 hours. Our rear was no great distance from the front, which made it possible for us to rotate our rest periods at reasonably frequent intervals and rest in a manner which was more or less refreshing. Not far from us, beside what was left of the street, was a signpost stating that we were 5 miles from the coast, the last 5 miles of our retreat from the Don, an almost incredible sweep of over 1,000 miles, much of it on foot. As the veteran sometimes jokingly said to me, "The same route your great-grandfather took with Napoleon, my boy. You might think of it as a family affair, if that's any consolation to you." Then one evening, as we were returning to the damp and icy cellar we used as a dormitory during our rest periods, we noticed that the civilian population of Memel had almost disappeared. The last shipload of refugees must have left while we were at the front. We walked through the darkness of the town, which was more like an abandoned cemetery than a town, and returned to our cellar with something like joy in our hearts. My companions sat huddled on their ragged pallets without talking, attacking whatever comestible Gransk had been able to produce, without even noticing what it was. It didn't matter a damn. Their attention was elsewhere. They were dreaming in the heavy silence, fixing their eyes, which burned with accumulated distress, on the dirty gray vault of our cellar. They were dreaming of the deliverance which must be near at hand, of the leaking hulk which would carry us out onto the sea against which we had been pressed for so long. They were dreaming, staring from their dark sockets with mad, transparent eyes, and it was understood that no one would speak. Their eyes, which had grown used to staring only at the war, had turned toward the possibility of an inner vision it was just possible to glimpse, with an intensity which I also felt in myself. They were dreaming, and so that the war wouldn't catch them at it, they tried to hide it, looking at no one and keeping their eyes fixed on some inner vision of hope. I was the only one who saw them. I saw them because I had nothing else to see. I had already dreamed too much, and perhaps had lost that capacity. Too many of my dreams had been nightmares. Even if I had still been able to dream, I wouldn't have dared, because in the end, when one of the dreams came true, it was too painful. So I no longer dreamed but watched the others, drinking in some of their hope, and turning it for moments at a time into concrete images. Worn boots on the slimy deck of a ship, boots, vomiting discolored, empty uniforms, and then I would stop because hope was so horrible. What forms did the hope of others take? It seemed that I no longer knew how to dream, and yet I too still possessed this impatience, which we hid and cherished like a treasure which life had not yet stolen. I still had it too, and was hiding it inside myself. I felt it, and heard it, shrieking through my silence, shrieking so loudly that it overwhelmed me like the noise of explosions. My balance was damaged by that sound, because I no longer dared lay claim to any particular hope or promise. I was afraid to ask too much, afraid that the least desire might seem like a demand. I was still alive and was afraid that somebody might notice. I had given everything else I had, my feelings, my anguish, my sorrow, my fear. I had also forgotten Paula, and so that I wouldn't still seem too rich, I had forgotten that I was too young. I was not in very good health, but everything at Memel was hard. People with holes in their stomachs as big as fists were asked to be brave. Others, whose blood was pouring out onto the snow, fired at the war until their eyes grew glassy. I was lucky. In spite of my fits of coughing and my bloody phlegm, I still had a spark of life, which I kept hidden. One must no longer ask anything of anybody. Even if God heard our prayers, whatever we received would be consumed. So I watched my companions as they dreamed. They too knew how dangerous dreams were in that place. Memel needed everything, dreams and hopes included. Men who still could hope fought better than those who couldn't. And we were all so tired of fighting. From time to time, one of us would emerge from torpor and scream. These screams were entirely involuntary. We couldn't stop them. They were produced by our exhaustion, by our organs writhing with fatigue. Some laughed as they howled, others prayed. Men who could pray could hope, and for so many hope was dead, so they howled their prayers. In any case, it was too late. Even if their prayers had been heard, God would no longer have dared to appear. He had abused his mercy, as in the case of Smelens, who had died that morning. Smelens had wanted to die, but not until he had received some news of his little brother, whom he had only seen twice. With dry eyes, we had watched the road which should have brought us the post, but no news came. Smelens had hung on to life as long as he could, but here, in Memel, it was too late for the all-powerful. During the following days, the first military evacuations took place. First, the units which had been most sorely tried, with the gravely wounded given priority, except for the hopeless cases, who would be as well off dying in Memel as anywhere else. The silently impatient joy of the less seriously injured, who could go, helped them to forget their wounds which were tortured by the cold. Gangrenous cases stopped thinking about the amputations which awaited them. It was as if a veil of confidence had drifted gently over the town. Except for the planes which hammered at us continuously, life might also have become life again. Ships gutted by bombs blocked the approaches to the piers. Mutilated corpses floated in the debris. The Navy was performing a prodigious task. We would have been lost without it. A barge packed with men had been bombed amidships by an adroit pilot who hit the bullseye the first time. We were summoned from our rest period to deal with the mess. I shall omit the details, the memory of which still nauseates me. Our boots were red with blood. The human refuse which we threw off the front of the half-submerged wreck drew a throng of fish, and the smell of bodies torn open by gaping wounds is beyond expression, even though the water washing over the carnage diminished it somewhat. The water in which we worked at first seemed warm in comparison to the air. After a short time, however, it began to seem like torture. Our gestures became slow and hesitant, and our hearts felt the wrenching of pain which clouded our vision. We had to hang on. 2 more ships were loading up with troops, and soon it would be our turn. By mid-morning, the sky cleared. The pale sun attempting to shine over this scene of disaster filled us with unease. Any pleasure in the sun had long ago been killed for us. It invariably meant Russian planes. Before we had finished our cleanup, the Russian fighter-bombers were overhead. This surprised no one. With good weather, it could only be expected. Limping on our painful feet, we ran as fast as we could for whatever shelter we could find. All the true concrete shelters were used as first aid hospitals or shelters for the wounded. We had to huddle in the ruins or in shell holes and bomb craters. We hid ourselves away in small clusters and tried to concentrate on our imminent escape. That concludes the 37th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.